It started like any regular Saturday. The sun was just beginning to rise behind the trees lining our quiet neighborhood street. The kind of morning where everything feels calm, even still. Birds chirping, kids' bikes tipped over in front yards, and the occasional lawn sprinkler ticking away in the distance. My wife had gone out to grab a few things for breakfast, and I was just getting back from a long overnight shift. She pulled into our driveway as I was walking up the front steps. I waved at her, tired but happy to see her smile. She parked the truck, opened the door, and started gathering a few grocery bags from the back seat. Nothing out of the ordinary. She wasn't being loud. She wasn't blocking anything. Just unloading a few bags of food like anyone else would. But it didn't take long for things to go sideways. Not even 5 minutes had passed when two people I didn't recognize started walking up the street. Clipboards in hand, matching blue polos, stern looks on their faces like they owned the pavement they were walking on. HOA enforcers. We'd had a few run-ins before. Mostly about things like the color of our mailbox or our trash bins being left out too long. Nothing major. Just enough to be annoying. But this time? This was different. They didn't stop at the sidewalk. They came right up our driveway, like they had the right to be there. No knock, no greeting. One of them, a tall guy with a stiff jaw and way too much energy for a Saturday morning, pointed at the truck and said something about a parking violation. My wife looked confused. "I'm just unloading groceries," she said, holding a bag in one arm, keys in the other. The man stepped closer. "This vehicle isn't allowed to be parked here for more than 10 minutes. It's clearly stated in the HOA bylaws. You need to move it now." She glanced at the clock on her phone. "I've been here less than 5. He didn't care. His voice got louder. "Move it or we'll issue a violation and a fine." That's when the second one, a woman with dark sunglasses and a clipboard, stepped in and said something under her breath. My wife turned to her, trying to stay calm, but it was clear she felt cornered. And then it happened. The tall guy grabbed her arm. It wasn't a tap. It wasn't a brush. He yanked her by the wrist like he was pulling her out of the way. She stumbled back against the truck. The bag of groceries slipped out of her hand, a carton of eggs crashing onto the pavement. I froze for a second, not believing what I was seeing. She looked stunned. So did the woman with the clipboard. There was a pause, like time slowed down for a moment. That's when I stepped forward. I wasn't wearing just any clothes. I was in full uniform. Badge on my chest. Duty belt strapped tight. I'd just come home from a federal law enforcement shift, an overnight detail I wasn't even supposed to be on. But I'd filled in for a teammate. And I guess that's when everything shifted. The man who had just grabbed my wife took one look at me and froze. His shoulders dropped. The woman beside him stopped writing whatever she was scribbling on her clipboard. I walked down the steps slowly, never breaking eye contact. My voice was calm but cold. "Is there a reason you just put your hands on my wife?" No answer. They glanced at each other. Then at my badge. Then back at me. Suddenly, their confidence evaporated. They started talking over each other, nervous, trying to explain. Words like misunderstanding and policy enforcement started flying around like confetti. But they knew. They had crossed a line they couldn't walk back. And now, they weren't in control anymore. Not even close. Subscribe if you've ever had to stand your ground, because this story's just getting started. They didn't know who they were dealing with. And honestly, I wasn't trying to throw around my badge. I don't walk around looking for trouble, and I sure don't expect to be respected just because of my uniform. But when someone lays hands on my wife, all bets are off. Especially in my own driveway. Especially by people who are supposed to be part of the same neighborhood. The man backed up a few steps. His eyes darted between my face and the badge clipped to my chest. His voice was shaking now. "We didn't mean any harm," he mumbled. "We were just trying to make sure the HOA rules were being followed." My wife stood beside the truck, rubbing her wrist where he'd grabbed her. She wasn't crying. She wasn't yelling. She was doing what she always does, staying calm even when someone's being completely unreasonable. But I could see it in her face. The shock. That silent mix of fear and disbelief that someone would escalate things so fast over something so ridiculous. The woman with the clipboard cleared her throat. We thought she was illegally parked. The truck looked like it had been there overnight. I raised an eyebrow. You made that assumption without knocking? Without asking? I pointed toward the street. You walked straight up like you owned the place. She opened her mouth to speak but thought better of it. And now, with me standing there, they were stammering. Stuck. You could see it clearly, they had power when they thought they were in control. But now? Now that they had to answer for it? Nothing but excuses. I pulled out my phone. Not to call anyone, just to make it clear I was recording. The moment I did, their tone changed again. Softer. Polite. Careful. Suddenly they weren't quoting bylaws or barking orders. Now they were trying to de-escalate. Now it was all about how it was a misunderstanding and how emotions got high. Yeah, no kidding. I turned to my wife. You okay? I asked. She nodded, but I saw the tightness in her jaw. That wasn't just a bruise forming on her arm. That was anger, quiet and steady. The kind of anger that doesn't shout but doesn't forget either. Then, just as we were about to go inside, the man said something that almost made me laugh. We're just trying to keep the community safe. He said that after laying hands on a woman who was unloading groceries. I turned back and looked him dead in the eye. Let me be clear. If you ever touch my wife again, or step onto my property without cause, you won't be explaining yourself to me. You'll be explaining to your supervisor, your board, and maybe even a judge. He opened his mouth, then shut it again. And then something else happened. Neighbors started to come out. Not in crowds, but enough. 2 people across the street. A woman on her porch down the block. One guy with his dog, slowing his walk and pretending to look at a tree while clearly listening. That's the thing about neighborhoods. Word travels fast. And when people see HOA enforcers getting humbled, they pay attention. The man finally mumbled, "We'll speak with the board." You do that, I said. And make sure you mention you laid hands on a homeowner's wife without consent. They left after that. No more threats. No ticket. No fine. Just awkward silence and quick footsteps. Inside the house, my wife sat down on the couch, still quiet. I handed her a cold water bottle and sat beside her. They've never crossed the line like that before, she said. Nope, I replied. But this time they did. We didn't need a big speech. We didn't need to yell. We just knew this wasn't over. People like that don't stop unless they're made to. And I wasn't about to let this slide. Because where I come from, you don't let bullies dress their control up as rules. You don't let power trip goons hide behind clipboards and pretend they're untouchable. And in this neighborhood, they just messed with the wrong house. The next morning, I noticed something odd. Our mailbox had a bright orange slip taped to it. Violation notice, in all caps. No envelope. No explanation beyond a handwritten note that claimed we had parked a non-compliant vehicle in a residential driveway in breach of HOA Code 4.6. It even listed the time, down to the minute, when my wife had been unloading groceries. I stood there holding the paper, staring at it like it was a joke. This wasn't about a truck anymore. This was retaliation. Pure and simple. It didn't take long for the doorbell to ring. It was Greg, our neighbor 2 houses down. He's a quiet guy, keeps to himself, but he must have seen what happened the day before. He handed me a small USB drive. You'll want this, he said. My security camera got everything. The angle's not perfect, but the audio's clear. I thanked him. Didn't ask questions. Just took it and went inside. When I plugged it into my laptop, the footage loaded fast. I scrubbed to the timestamp and there it was, the HOA enforcer grabbing my wife's arm. You could hear her say, "Don't touch me," and you could see the man pulling her back toward the truck. It was crystal clear. No shouting. No threats from her. Just a neighbor trying to bring groceries inside. I knew right then I wasn't going to let it go. I printed 3 still frames from the video. One of my wife holding the bags, one of the enforcer grabbing her arm, and one of me stepping into view. Then I opened up the HOA handbook they'd mailed to us when we moved in. I found the section on community behavior and conduct. It spelled out in bold, HOA representatives must act with respect, refrain from physical contact, and treat residents with professionalism at all times. They broke their own rules. Later that day, I made a few calls. One to the HOA board. One to the management company listed on the back of the violation notice. And one more to a friend who works in civil law. I wasn't looking to file a lawsuit just yet, I just wanted to know my options. I wanted to understand exactly what these people were allowed to do. Turns out not much. HOA enforcers have no law enforcement authority. They're not police. They can't detain you. They certainly can't put their hands on you. And most importantly, they're accountable to the board. Which means if a resident has a complaint backed by proof, the board is required to review it. So I packaged everything up, video, stills, printed statements, and the violation slip, and dropped it off at the HOA office myself. I didn't say much. Just handed it to the front desk manager and said, "This is regarding an incident involving 2 of your field agents. You'll want to look at the footage before contacting me." By the next morning, the violation slip was gone. No one came to remove it. It just vanished. No note, no apology. Nothing. But something told me that wasn't the end of it. 3 days later, we got a letter in the mail, not a violation, but a formal response from the HOA board. They said they were reviewing the conduct of their enforcement staff and would follow up once their investigation was complete. The language was stiff and corporate, but I knew what it meant. They got caught. Now I wasn't just some guy with a badge. I was a resident who had proof. And that made me a problem for them. Later that evening, I saw the same enforcers walking down the opposite side of the street. They didn't look up. Didn't even glance toward our house. And for the first time since we moved in, I felt something shift. Not just for us, but for every neighbor who ever got bullied, fined, or embarrassed for something that didn't matter. Because when people push back with facts, not fear, everything changes. And I was just getting warmed up. About a week passed. Things stayed quiet. No more knocks, no more slips taped to the mailbox, and no more patrols creeping by the driveway like they used to. But quiet doesn't always mean peaceful. Sometimes, it just means something's brewing. Then I got a call. Not from the HOA board, but from a woman who introduced herself as Janet. "I'm the new compliance coordinator," she said, sounding like she'd just finished reading a script. "We're conducting internal reviews and would like to schedule a time to discuss your recent experience." That's corporate talk for, "We're trying to cover our tracks." I agreed to meet, on my terms. At a coffee shop down the road. Neutral ground. I wasn't inviting anyone from the HOA into my home again, not after what happened. Janet showed up alone. Late 40s, professional, polite, and clearly uncomfortable. She apologized before she even sat down. "I've reviewed the footage," she said, sliding a small folder across the table. "We do not condone what happened." I opened it. Inside was a printed letter from the board. Not handwritten, but official. It admitted the enforcer acted outside of training protocols and said he had been placed under review pending further action. Not fired. Not suspended. Just under review. "Is that it?" I asked her, staring at the letter. She nodded, hesitated, then added, "We're retraining our enforcement staff. And we'll be updating our policies on resident engagement." It sounded nice. Professional. But it wasn't enough. "My wife could have been seriously hurt," I told her. "That man didn't just break a rule, he put his hands on her without consent. And then he tried to bury it under a fake violation notice." Janet didn't try to argue. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she'd already seen the writing on the wall. She just said, "I understand." I asked one last thing before we ended the meeting. "How many other residents have filed complaints like this?" Her eyes shifted. "That information's confidential," she replied. Which told me everything I needed to know. I left the coffee shop more fired up than ever. If this had happened to my wife, it probably wasn't the first time. And I had the proof. Others might not. That's when I made the decision to take it one step further. I typed up a letter. 1 page. Short, direct, and without anger. Just facts. I printed 20 copies and dropped them off at a few neighbors' doors, only the ones I trusted. It explained what happened, what I found in the HOA handbook, and how I filed a formal report with evidence. I didn't ask anyone to join me or start a fight. I just gave them the truth. 2 days later, I started getting messages. One neighbor said she was fined for her teenage son parking in their own driveway for more than 30 minutes. Another said the HOA tried to cite them for a flag hanging from their porch, even though it was well within community guidelines. And another woman, elderly, lives at the end of the block, said an HOA officer walked into her backyard to check for weeds. That's not enforcement. That's harassment. So I invited them to my house that weekend. Not a protest, not a fight, just a conversation. 9 people showed up. Some brought photos, letters, or stories. Most were just tired. Tired of the games. Tired of being intimidated. Tired of being afraid to speak up. I laid everything out on the table. My story. The footage. The handbook rules. And I said, I'm not here to fight anyone. I just want our neighborhood back. Heads nodded. No one shouted. No one overreacted. It was calm. Respectful. But serious. Because the truth is, the moment one person pushes back, others realize they can too. And once people see that the power these enforcers carry is nothing but a clipboard and a loud voice, it's not so scary anymore. It's just noise. And slowly, that noise was starting to quiet down. Word traveled fast. After that small meeting at my house, I noticed a shift in the neighborhood I hadn't seen in years. People who used to keep their heads down started making eye contact. They waved more. They stopped to chat. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but something was changing. A quiet kind of courage was waking up in people. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. Normally, those meetings were half empty. A few board members, maybe 1 or 2 nosy neighbors, and a lot of silence. But this time, the room was packed. Standing room only. Folks who hadn't been to a single meeting in years showed up, some with copies of their fines, others with printouts of bylaws they'd never read before this week. And I was there, sitting in the front row. Not to start trouble. Just to listen. The board looked nervous. The president, a guy named Carl, opened the meeting like usual. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Tonight we'll review budget updates and, he paused, glanced around the room, then cleared his throat, and addressed some recent concerns raised by residents. People didn't yell. They didn't storm the table or demand anyone be fired. What they did was worse for the board. They asked smart questions. Calm questions. The kind that expose cracks. What's the process for training HOA enforcers? Who reviews their conduct? Can homeowners request body cam footage or written reports from incidents? Someone asked about insurance liability. Someone else mentioned property rights. And when it was my turn, I stood up and didn't raise my voice once. I just asked one question. What's the board's response when one of their agents puts their hands on a resident's spouse? Carl looked like he forgot how to swallow. He glanced at his legal advisor, who leaned in and whispered something. Then Carl replied carefully, "We're still reviewing that incident." I held up a copy of the letter they had sent me. According to this, the review ended last week. The room went silent. They weren't ready for someone who came prepared. Someone who had video, witnesses, and the law on his side. And they certainly weren't ready for a whole room of neighbors finally paying attention. After the meeting ended, people stayed behind. They asked questions, compared notes. Some shared their own run-ins with the enforcers. And slowly, you could feel the fear peeling off like old paint. That weekend, something else happened. A new notice went out, one printed on clean paper with the HOA's official seal. It announced that all future field enforcers would be required to wear visible ID tags, complete new de-escalation training, and operate under body cameras during resident interactions. That last part? That was something we had pushed for during the meeting. Small win maybe, but big message. You see, these people didn't expect anyone to fight back. They expected fear, silence, or frustration, but not unity. They never thought a quiet man in uniform would be the spark that made everyone wake up and realize how far things had gone. But it didn't stop there. One by one, people started challenging old fines. One neighbor got hers overturned. Another filed an official complaint against a board member who'd been verbally aggressive. A couple who'd been afraid to speak out before finally stepped forward and told their story about an HOA agent threatening to call animal control over their therapy dog. The board started sweating. They called for patience. They sent out updates. They even tried to host a neighborhood appreciation barbecue the following month. But we weren't interested in free burgers. We wanted accountability. And now, for the first time in years, they were the ones feeling watched. Not the other way around. Because once people stop being afraid of the clipboard, once they realize their voice actually matters, everything starts to shift. And from where I stood, it was just getting good. The following week, I was out front washing the truck. The same one my wife had been unloading groceries from when this whole mess started. It still had a few faint scuff marks where she'd been pushed into it, but I wasn't in a hurry to polish them out. They were a reminder, not of weakness, but of what happens when people push back. As I sprayed down the tires, I noticed a familiar car crawl by. It was the same HOA enforcer's vehicle. Not the woman, but the tall guy, the one who grabbed my wife's wrist. He didn't get out this time. Just drove real slow past the house, looked my way, then turned the corner and disappeared down the street. I didn't flinch. He could look all he wanted. But the days of intimidating people on this street were over. Later that evening, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. A group of neighbors were gathered near the corner house. Normally, everyone stayed in their own yards, waved politely, and went on with their day. But this time, they were out there talking. Not gossiping, planning. A whiteboard had been propped against someone's fence, and I recognized a few words written in thick black marker: committee nominees. Turns out they weren't just angry anymore. They were organizing. A few folks had gone digging into the HOA charter and found something interesting. Every year, 3 board seats came up for election. The problem was, most people never even knew when voting happened. It wasn't advertised. Ballots were mailed quietly, deadlines buried in fine print. But this year, that wasn't going to fly. The neighborhood had decided to run their own candidates. People who actually lived here. People who'd been fined, pressured, or ignored. Regular folks. A retired teacher. A single mom. A guy who'd lived on the same street for 22 years and never once got a fair answer from the board. They asked me if I'd consider running too. I didn't say yes. But I didn't say no. Instead, I offered to help. I showed them how to file complaints that couldn't be ignored. I helped write clean, clear campaign statements. I even walked door to door with a few neighbors to make sure everyone knew when and how to vote. It felt different. Powerful, but quiet. Not a protest. Not a war. Just people waking up to the fact that this place belonged to them, not the HO, not the clipboard crowd, not a couple of self-important board members tucked behind conference tables. And you know what? Even people who'd been skeptical started showing up. Like Joe. Joe's the kind of guy who never got involved in anything. Just wanted to mow his lawn, fix up his car on the weekends, and be left alone. But 2 days after the committee meeting, he showed up at my door with a wrinkled manila envelope. Inside were 7 different notices he'd gotten over the past 2 years. All of them for things that weren't even real violations. He'd just paid them because he didn't want the hassle. I thought I was the only one, he said. He wasn't. One by one, stories kept coming. A new one from almost every house. Someone told me the HOA tried to fine them for a bird bath being too decorative. Another had been cited for their porch light being a non-approved fixture. It was laughable, but not when you realized how many people had just accepted it quietly for years. That's what systems like this count on. They don't win because they're right. They win because people give up. But we weren't giving up anymore. By the end of that week, the HOA office had received more feedback forms than it had in the last 2 years combined. Residents were attending every meeting. Nominee flyers were going up. Not trashing the current board, just offering a new voice, a better way. One built on respect, not threats. I stood on my porch one evening, watching the sun dip behind the trees, and I realized something simple. Sometimes you don't need to raise your voice to make a point. Sometimes just standing tall, shoulder to shoulder with people who've had enough, is all it takes. And for the first time since we moved in, this neighborhood actually felt like a community. Election day came quicker than anyone expected. What used to be a silent event barely mentioned in a corner of the newsletter had now turned into a full-blown neighborhood moment. People who had never cared about HOA meetings were suddenly asking questions, bringing up rules, showing up early just to cast their votes. Even those who said, "Nothing ever changes," were lining up with pens in hand. The old board didn't look pleased. Carl, the president, stood near the entrance table, forcing smiles that didn't quite reach his eyes. Next to him were the usual clipboard holders, dressed neat, stiff, and too quiet. They weren't handing out ballots like before. Now there were volunteers, neighbors, organizing the line and helping people who needed assistance. It wasn't chaos. It was controlled, focused. People had come prepared. I kept to the back, watching it unfold. I hadn't put my name on the ballot, but I'd helped those who did. I knew their stories, knew their reasons for stepping up. They weren't power-hungry or looking to settle scores. They just wanted the bullying to stop. They wanted fairness. They wanted to live without being harassed for having a garden gnome or leaving their car in the driveway too long while unloading groceries. By noon, the community center had more traffic than I'd ever seen. Seniors from the far end of the street, parents with strollers, teenagers dropping off ballots for their grandparents. People brought copies of fines they'd kept for years, still angry about how they were treated. One neighbor showed me a violation notice she received for non-conforming mailbox design. All she'd done was repaint it with a fresh coat of gray. Another said he'd been fined 3 times in 1 month for the same supposed fence height issue, fines that totaled over $300 before he even got a chance to appeal. These weren't rare stories. They were normal here. Until now. Mid-afternoon, someone announced the ballot count would begin at 6 p.m. sharp. Everyone knew this was the moment. You could feel the tension shift. The HOA board stood huddled together on one side of the room, whispering. Across from them stood the nominees, our neighbors, holding clipboards and homemade posters with their names scribbled in permanent marker. Not a fancy campaign. Just honesty. At 6:03, a quiet man with glasses and a calculator stepped up to the front of the room. He cleared his throat. He wasn't a politician. Just a long-time resident who'd volunteered to count the votes. "We've tallied every submission," he said. 3 seats were up for vote this cycle. He paused. Looked up. All 3 will be filled by new members. The room didn't cheer. It didn't erupt. It just breathed. Deep, long, relieved breaths. Like the whole block had been holding tension in their chests for years, and now it was finally safe to exhale. The former board members didn't say much. Carl packed up his folder, nodded to someone behind him, and left through the side door. Just like that. No speech. No apology. Just silence. But that silence said everything. Change didn't come from yelling in the street or throwing accusations online. It came from people showing up. From asking questions. From telling their stories out loud instead of swallowing them in private. From refusing to let someone in a logoed shirt and a clipboard bully them into submission. Later that night, I walked back home with my wife. We didn't say much. Just held hands and listened to the soft hum of the neighborhood behind us. Porch lights on. Windows open. Laughter from a yard nearby. The same street where a man once grabbed her by the wrist without warning now felt different. Not perfect, but finally moving in the right direction. As we reached our front steps, she looked at me and said, "Can you believe all of this started with a bag of groceries?" I smiled. Not because it was funny, but because it was true. And that's the thing about small moments. Sometimes they crack open something bigger. All it takes is one person who won't back down. The days that followed felt lighter. Not because everything was suddenly perfect, but because people finally had a reason to hope. You could see it in the way folks walked their dogs, slower, more relaxed. You could feel it in the way neighbors waved, not out of politeness, but with real connection. This wasn't just about an HOA election. This was about something that had been brewing for a long time. And now, the fear that had hung over this neighborhood like a thick fog was starting to lift. One morning, as I was sipping coffee on the porch, the same elderly woman who used to quietly tend her roses at the end of the block walked by. She smiled, then called out, "I just got my first spring planter approved." No questions asked. I smiled back. That wouldn't have happened 2 months ago. Later that week, one of the newly elected board members, Angela, the retired teacher, dropped by to talk. She wasn't there to make promises or hand out rules. She just wanted to hear what people thought, what changes they needed most. And for the first time, the words coming from someone on the board felt real. Angela listened, not like a politician, but like a neighbor. She asked how my wife was doing, asked how many others had dealt with similar harassment. I told her the stories. Not just ours, but all the ones we'd heard since that day in the driveway. She shook her head and said, "This board has some cleaning up to do." But more than anything, she made something clear. It wasn't just about correcting the bad behavior. It was about rebuilding trust. The new board didn't wait long. Within 2 weeks, they released a revised policy list. Clearer rules. Simpler language. More transparency. No more vague citations. No more stealth fines. From now on, if a resident got a violation, there had to be a photo attached and a proper written explanation. They also opened up monthly Q/and sessions. Casual meetups. No formal tables, no microphones, just neighbors and board members talking face to face. Coffee, folding chairs, open ears. And people showed up. Not to complain, but to be heard. It wasn't flashy, but it worked. Because power doesn't always fall with a bang. Sometimes, it fades quietly, when people stop giving it blind respect and start asking the right questions. One evening, I saw the old enforcer again. The same one who had yanked my wife's arm. He was walking alone, clipboard gone, no badge or title, just a guy passing through. He didn't stop. Didn't say a word. Just looked at me for half a second, then kept walking. I didn't need a confrontation. I didn't need revenge. The fact that he had no authority left to wave around? That was enough. My wife was back to her usual rhythm, running errands, watering the plants, waving at neighbors like none of this had happened. But every now and then, when she glanced at the side of the truck where those eggs hit the ground, I could see the flicker in her eyes. The memory never fully fades. But neither does what we built from it. Because that one moment, that one grab, that one arrogant move, ignited something bigger than either of us saw coming. It made a quiet neighborhood speak up. It made a tired group of homeowners remember their power. It turned silence into action. And looking around now, you'd never guess it started with something so small. A clipboard. A wrist. A badge. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the biggest changes don't begin with noise or banners or breaking news. Maybe they start when one person decides enough is enough, and others follow. Now, when I step outside, I don't just see driveways and fences. I see stories. I see people who stood up. I see a community that remembered how to fight, not with fists or anger, but with truth and unity. And the best part? We're just getting started. The calendar flipped to a new month, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't dread checking the mailbox. No random violations. No threats tucked into envelopes. Just regular mail. A couple of flyers. A reminder for the upcoming community picnic, the first one organized by the new board. Funny how things had changed. That morning, I took a walk around the block. Nothing unusual. Just needed to clear my head. But what I saw along the way spoke louder than any fine or letter ever had. I saw kids riding bikes without nervous parents yelling at them to stay close to the house. I saw a man repainting his front door, something we were all told was non-compliant under the old rules. And not a single clipboard in sight. There was a new energy in the air. Not loud, not obvious. Just steady. As I passed the neighbor's house, the one with the therapy dog, he waved and gave me a nod. "They finally cleared my record," he said. "Took them long enough." A few houses down, a woman who'd been fined for her porch swing was sitting on it proudly, coffee in hand. She didn't look worried. She looked settled. That kind of peace? You can't fake it. Later that day, I met up with a few folks who were part of the election effort. We didn't gather in protest this time. We were just sharing stories. Laughing, remembering how awkward those first conversations were. How some of us didn't even know our neighbors' names before all of this started. One of them said, "I thought I was the only one. Until you spoke up." That stuck with me. Because honestly, I didn't speak up to be a leader. I just refused to stay quiet. It never sat right with me, watching people get pushed around by some inflated sense of power just because someone printed a badge on a polo shirt. And when it came to my wife, that was my line. What none of us expected was how many others had been holding on to their own stories. Waiting. Hoping someone else would go first. And that's really what made the difference. It wasn't just about one fight in a driveway. It was about a neighborhood remembering what it felt like to stand together. To say, we live here. We have a say. We matter. The new board didn't fix everything overnight. There were still rules. Still structure. But now, there was also fairness. Clarity. Respect. You could appeal something without getting punished for it. You could ask questions without being treated like a problem. And if someone crossed the line again, you knew you wouldn't be alone. Even the way people talked changed. More eye contact. More laughter across fences. Less of that stiff, walk-on-eggshells feeling that used to hang over this place like a storm cloud. And for once, the HO didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a part of the community again. The way it should have been all along. That evening, I got back home and found my wife sitting on the porch, scrolling through her phone with that same calm look she always wears. She looked up and smiled. You see how many people RSVP'd for the picnic? I smiled back. Let me guess. More than ever. By a mile, she said. We didn't need a big speech. We didn't need to bring up the past. Because everything we needed to know was already written into the way things felt now. The sidewalks were fuller. The doors more open. And the silence we used to live under? Replaced by something a whole lot louder, unity. And the best part? None of us had to shout to be heard. We just had to speak up. One voice at a time.